Helen, welcome to another Time Team Tea Time chat. This is a place I remember because the huge number of Anglo-Saxon brooches. How do you react when that number of finds comes up in a location?
I think the first thing I'm going to do is ask you, Tim, whether you can hear the awful grinding noise that's going on at my end. Angus is extracting honey. I'm just going to go and shut the door.
You have bees, do you?
We have bees, yes. It's our second year of harvesting the honey, so we
Oh,
don't really know what we're doing.
congratulations.
Thank you.
So,
So the question, that's a really good question. And that question is one that I have been thinking about a lot, because it's not just time teams where we get brooches brought to us as Portable Antiquities Scheme staff, and then when there's an excavation, those brooches are nowhere to be found. And I know what Mick would be saying to me if we were having that conversation. He'd be saying, well, doesn't that mean they're hoiked out of the graves by the detectorists? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't, because generally you have brooches around your neck and shoulders, and often they stain collarbones and the tops of arms and things, and we don't find graves that have brooches that have been taken out of them. And I've been really thinking about this, and I think my answer is that obviously the metal detectorists are only finding the big pieces of metal, so they're only finding the graves with brooches, whereas archaeologists find the graves that are there in the place they've chosen to dig. If it's there, they'll find it. It doesn't have to have a brooch. So the ratio of graves to brooches can be quite low. And really, I need somebody like a student to go through quite a few published excavation reports to find out for me what actually the ratio of woman to brooch is. How many women have them, how many women don't? At the moment, I don't know that very basic question, but it's a good one.
What are they called, those big brooches that
The
go
ones
on them?
that we had at the beginning are cruciform brooches, most of them. The larger ones are cruciform, and the smaller ones are called small long, because they were all known as long brooches to begin with, and then the large ones are called cruciform, even though they're not cross-shaped. And so that left the small ones to be called small long brooches.
And what was that collection like at Charlton? Was it a fairly special? Was it typical, or were there things in there that were unique or interesting?
No, it was typical. It was numerous. So I mean, I wasn't involved at that early stage. I wasn't involved in selecting the site. If I had been, I might have said, well, you're either dealing with a large cemetery, that would be the good thing. The bad thing, the worst alternative, is you're dealing with a cemetery which has been so hammered by the plough that all the brooches have been scooped up into the topsoil, because 2021, whatever the total was, is a lot. But I think as we had the metal detectorists excavation, we knew he had found a body reasonably intact. So I think you could have predicted that, and clearly whoever picked the site did predict that the cemetery would have some intact burials.
And I like the fact that we were working there with a responsible detectorist who had by and large done the right thing, and presumably for the Portable Antiquities Scheme, these sort of people are quite important.
They are. We've been dealing with a detectorist who'd done all the right things as they were at the time. I mean, you have to remember it's nearly 20 years ago, and at that time we were encouraging people to detect and to bring us things and to report them, and we would record them. Now we do encourage much more good locations, because on the programme you could see Phil kind of politely asking. What we didn't see on the programme was my memory of Phil, which is him just sounding off about how appalling it was that this chap didn't know where he'd found it. And I had to, I mean, over the years since, I've remembered all the times that archaeologists haven't properly located their trenches, and we go on and on about why couldn't this 19th century person have tied it in better. But you see, no one ever expects Time Team to turn up and give them the third degree about where they found something. In 2003, we just used to say which field. Now we say, give me a 10-figure grid reference.
Yes, and of course now people carry GPSs on their phones and things. It's all a bit easier. Just quickly to discuss something that's come up recently. I've seen a couple of reports which have said, you know, Time Team goes to the historic sites and finds stuff, and isn't that in a way encouraging some of our less responsible metal detectorists to sort of dive into these sites afterwards? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, everybody benefits from a Time Team. Everybody who watches it, everybody in the village that it happens in, everybody around the world benefits from the greater knowledge that we have gained from spending the 3 days in the field and all the other days researching. And I don't think it's really fair to say that shouldn't be put on the television because somebody might go out and nick something from it. That's a bit like saying Antiques Roadshow encourages theft, or Gardener's World encourages people to go and nick your garden furniture. Oh, look, we all know that Monty Don's got a lovely garden. Let's go around and dig up his plants. It only directs people to something that they might do if they're doing something wrong anyway. And I think it's linked to this feeling that that night hawking, that stealing our heritage is what they call a victimless crime. People say, well, you didn't know it was buried in the ground and now it's been stolen. Why should you be upset about it? It didn't really belong to you, did it? It was in the ground. You didn't know it was there. But it belongs to all of us, and we've all lost the knowledge about it. So yeah, it's a ridiculous argument, and the fact that there are people who are prepared to go out and steal archaeological objects is awful, and it isn't a victimless crime. But I think the people who are as guilty are the people who are prepared to buy them. If there was no market, there'd be no stealing. It's the people who are involved in the antiquities trade, who are buying antiquities, buying archaeological objects with no context. They're fueling the fire, and it's not that Time Team are finding out more about our past. They're not part of the problem.
I think at one stage we even went so far as seeding sites with copper coins occasionally, where there was a real danger. We would spread random bits of copper. I think I remember 2 or 3 huge bags of twopenny bits being strewn around the site just to give it an added bit of protection.
That's a very good point. The site that we seeded was, the one that I remember was Borsey, which was back in 1998. And the world was a very different place there in terms of illicit metal detecting. On the Portable Antiquities Scheme, we've been working for 20 years to raise awareness of how this is not a victimless crime, and it is not something that anybody should be doing. But in 1998, there were far more nighthawks around then than there are now. So I think it was something that was probably necessary in 1998. I do still feel rather awkward about it, rather conflicted, because it means that we'll never be able to carry out any form of metal detecting survey on Borsey ever again, because we have put that protection there which stops illicit detecting, but it also stops any form of detecting. So that's a bit awkward, and I wish we hadn't had to do it. But you're right, if Time Team's been somewhere, if you raise the awareness that not just that it's an interesting place, but that it's a place that in a sense the heritage of which belongs to all of us, then there's less acceptance that it's okay to go and dig a hole in it and find a coin or something that you then take away. It's all of our past. Why is one person taking it? But there's another thing about metal detecting which I think was very well shown at South Carlton, and that was that normally you can't see a site that's being eroded by the plough until it's too late, because the buried archaeology the topsoil is eroded down into the buried archaeology and erodes the top of that buried archaeology, and that leaves the objects in the topsoil. But if you aren't looking in the topsoil, you won't see the objects and you won't know about the plough damage. If there hadn't been a detectorist working on South Carlton, we wouldn't know about the plough damage. We would never have been able to recover even 1 or 2 or 3 of the bodies, and it might have just been ploughed away to nothing. We don't know what's going on there at the moment, as far as I know. It may all have gone by now. One ridging for potatoes could have taken the whole lot away. And so metal detectorists are also actively helping us to protect and look after what remains of our past, because like with aerial photographs, they spot a bit of archaeology just as it's being eroded by the plough.
One of the things you mentioned there, often we work with farmers on Time Team. Do you think farmers have gradually got more aware of archaeology on their landscape and the depth they plough and things like that?
I think there is, particularly as for other reasons, no-till has become quite fashionable. You hear about no-till on the archers now. It's good for your soil structure. It's good for all sorts of things. We're at a very early stage with it. You know, the use of herbicides. The use of herbicides is very controversial within no-till, but it's undeniably good for the archaeology. And so those two things have coincided at a good moment. But Time Team, you know, Time Team had such a reach, far further than any conventional archaeological means. An archaeologist can only talk to so many people unless they have television to help them, and farmers would know all sorts of things after a Time Team. They would say things like, "Are you going to schedule my site?" And you think, how do you know about a scheduled site? And you could then say, no, not just finds. You have to have some archaeology like on Time Team. You know, that's what you need to schedule it. And so it was a lot quicker to have a conversation with a farmer after Time Team than before Time Team.
One of my memories of South Carlton was the female burial that Victor did that beautiful drawing of, and it was quite an interesting image, that, because it raised issues in my mind about, was this her shield, was it the family shield, and exactly what role did that play in the burial? It was a fascinating image, really.
It was, and that is one of the reasons I was so keen to go back to the report, because it's all very well looking at bones in the ground until they're washed and laid out, and you've got your calipers to take measurements and all your tables and everything else. Until you're back in the lab, you can't really know what you're dealing with. And one of the first things I always wanted to see when that report came out was, what did the osteologist back at Wessex Archaeology think of Margaret's theory? And there's a whole paragraph in the report given over to, is this a woman or is it a man? And it says, in the field, this was identified as having features of a woman from the skull. And said, well, cleaned up, it was obvious that skull had features that could be a man or could be a woman. It had a gracile skull, and you couldn't tell one way or the other. And it said, when it was coupled with the fact that it was tall, which Margaret had pointed out, and it had huge feet and very big femurs, it does seem perhaps to tip the balance to it being a man. And my view is that if whoever this person was, if they were dressing up as a man, they were pretending to be a man, if they wanted to be a man, if they wanted the world to see them as a man, I'm happy to see them as a man too.
Are we saying here that it's a relative rarity in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries to find women with shields? I think we found women with spears before. Are those objects gender specific?
Very much so. You can. The Anglo-Saxon world, the early Anglo-Saxon world, has two ways essentially of being buried. You can be buried with a female kit, and you can be buried with a male kit, and the two never blend. You never get a woman holding a sword as a sword, you know, and beads. You never get someone dressed as a woman who is holding a sword. You never get someone who is dressed as a man with a spindle whorl, say. These two kits are completely, they're like black and white, they're like chalk and cheese, they don't mix. And when you can sex the bones with them, almost always the sexing of the bones matches. And sometimes you get an uncertain, I know Jackie McKinley always puts one question mark in front of it, or two question marks, and those are her kind of 6 gradations: as male, female, male with one question mark, female with one question mark, and with 2. And I have never seen, or very rarely seen, anything that's even 2 question marks female with a sword and a shield. You do get women with spearheads, and you do get women with swords, but they're converted and they're used to something else, and we think they're being used for weaving equipment. There's something about women and weaving, or women in needlework, that is like men and weapons. It's the thing that defines a woman. So although a woman will do 1,001 other jobs and a man will have 1,001 other hobbies, those things are not reflected in their grave. You don't find a man with a spade, and you don't find a woman with a grinding stone. You just don't.
I've got a feeling that we've probably disappointed many of our female fans, who probably rather love the idea of a Saxon lady warrior with her shield and spear clenched between her teeth, and
Joan of Arc, yes.
Yes, maybe
one day we might find a slip of a girl with these things, but she'll always be as unusual as Joan of Arc. As an archaeologist, you have to deal in what happens most of the time, and it's the broad sweep. And the broad sweep, women aren't buried as warriors. They might have been able to fight, but they weren't seen that way in death.
What is the most amazing Anglo-Saxon buried object that you found?
The 2 things that stick in my memory are there's a crow or a magpie, some kind of that kind of species of bird that's in a grave I can't actually remember where it is. I think it's somewhere in the Midlands, and that has always haunted me. It's a mistake to imagine that because an animal dies at the same time as a human, why is it in the grave? Did it die at the same time as the human and just happen to be put in? Or it's very unlikely for a pet to die at the same time. So that has I've always wondered, what's the story behind that? But the strangest group, the strangest pattern, which you can't ignore and you can't forget because it's a pattern, but it's not a pattern found anywhere else. I'm sorry I bang on about it all the time, but it's Time Team's Bremer excavation. It just, that something really weird is going on there, and I don't like to say we'll never know what it was, because I feel that we could have a go at trying to work out what's going on there, but it's going to need a lot more work and a lot more money.
Could you just explain what it was for those who've not seen Bremer, and why it's so weird? And incidentally, didn't we find at Bremer the animal at the woman's feet somewhere, a small dog or something like that? Yeah.
Yes, there was a dog at Bremer, which again is a real problem. If your dog dies, you're not going to keep it and bury it when you die. If you die, hardly anybody's going to kill your dog. Why is there a human dog double burial? That is really weird. But the really strange thing about Bremer was that every burial contained a bucket, at least one. Now, a bucket is normally something. This is a small. It's a bit like my cup of tea. It's a drinking vessel with straight sides. Normally made of yew wood, so very, very beautiful, but slightly poisonous, yew wood is. And at Bremer they were stacked one in another. I don't know of any other stacked buckets. And when I say there was one per burial, we didn't find the burial cuts, and I'm not convinced that that's because it was difficult soil. As far as I can remember, it didn't seem terribly difficult soil to me. I wonder whether we came down inside a huge chamber, and actually it had more than one person in, and the buckets were a kind of communal thing. It's such, I cannot stress to you what a weird burial it was. There are chamber graves where stuff has been stacked, but they don't have more than one person in them. So whatever's going on at Bremer, it is very odd, and it's very odd in the artifacts, and it's very odd in the burial rite, and 3 days, while it's enough to do many things, it's not enough to fully understand something like that. And if we'd known what was there, I think we wouldn't have taken it on. But you know, for good or ill, we did. We now know that there's something extraordinary there, and it needs to be sorted out. And it probably will be. When I'm a very old lady, I'll probably be wheeled in my wheelchair up to the re-excavation of Bremer, because it is such an odd place that people won't be able to resist it. But I wish they'd get on with it.